And as Fran said, unfortunately I have to leave about 3:20. So when I go, please don't think it's because I've got fed up or I'm backing out of discussion or anything. It's just that I've got a time problem. Secondly, I just wanted to say something about Mother Agnes, the Syrian nun who had been invited to this conference. I don't know her, I've never met her, I don't agree with everything she says, but I think the work she does in trying to bring reconciliation at the local level in the areas where she's been is very important, and I think I would have been very happy to share the platform with her. Well, the first thing, I mean, everybody knows it, it's hardly worth repeating. The Syrian crisis is the worst humanitarian political tragedy in the world today. As you know, there are something like 6 million Syrians homeless within their own country. There are 2.5 million who are homeless outside the country in refugee camps in Turkey, Lebanon, and Jordan. And some, of course, have gone further afield. Those with a bit of money have been able to get further away. Secondly, it is producing incredible numbers of casualties. The latest figures are probably around 120,000 people have died. But it is important to stress that this is a bit different from many recent wars where the largest number of people killed are civilians. This is not actually the case in Syria, although you wouldn't necessarily know that from a lot of the media coverage, where when the figures of 120,000 are mentioned, the implication is that these are all civilians, and very often the implication in the way it's reported is that most of them are victims of the Syrian government's military strategy of artillery attacks and aircraft bombing and so on. In fact, if you take the figures of the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights, which more or less supports the opposition, it's not a pro-government statistical exercise, they counted up to the end of August 38,000 civilians had died, which is of course a huge number of people, but the number of government soldiers and pro-government militias, Sharia and the local defense forces and so on, 44,000 have died. So actually more government soldiers and supporters, armed supporters are dying than civilians. And then about 15,000 rebel fighters have also died. Now, as I say, the impression in the media is that the death is coming largely from the artillery strikes of the regime and the bombing by helicopters, gunships and fixed-wing aircraft. That is true, there is a great deal of destruction caused like that, but the rebels are conducting ambushes all the time around the country. So these young Syrian conscripts who are manning some sort of rather remote checkpoint on the road, some on the main roads or on the side roads, are almost sitting ducks for nighttime ambush attacks, and that is why the number of Syrian government troops dying is as high as it is. There's not, you can't say there's sort of good on one side and bad on the other, and it's a simple white hat versus black hat operation. I think people are realizing more and more that this is a very complex thing. In fact, there aren't two sides, there are many sides. The opposition side is fragmented into about 100 at least different armed groups. Often it's just one strong guy with a few men behind him who's acting on his own. And within the opposition, of course, the jihadi element, the foreign element, the jihadi element is getting stronger and stronger, and this is largely alien to Syrian culture, which is a very moderate kind of Sunni, Sufi Islam. It's not this jihadi fundamentalist kind of thing that we're getting increasingly strong in the country. It's also true that the sieges of towns, which has been a big issue in the media recently, is not done only by one side. It is true that in Muadamia, where we saw TV pictures recently of people coming out actually with Mother Agnes's help, well, they were under siege by the government, and the government was preventing food from going in. It's also true that in the eastern suburbs where chemical attacks took place earlier this year in the summer, that is an area that is largely under siege by the government. But then you come to places like the old city of Homs, where the International Committee of the Red Cross and the Syrian Red Crescent tried to get people out who wanted to come out, who are actually Christians, and they were not allowed out by the rebels. They were holding people in as it was a siege within a siege. They were surrounded by the government, but within that area they were not allowing the Catholic and Christians to come out. And the same is true in western Aleppo. A huge number of people are essentially under siege by rebel opposition forces and are in desperate need of food. So this whole issue of food shortages, manipulated for political reasons, is unfortunately something that's happening all over, and it's not something you can only blame the government on. But let me come quickly to the good news, because my time is limited. There are 4 good pieces of good news. Of course, it's relative. The first is obviously the tremendous decision by the British Parliament to deny Cameron the right to, or the permission to use British forces in an attack on Syria in September. That was an incredibly important turnaround. I mean, it's the first time really that public opinion in this country has stopped a war. It didn't work over Afghanistan, it didn't work over Iraq, even though a majority of people in this country were against it, but it has worked on Syria. And of course it had a huge knock-on effect in the United States as well, and I think it's one of the reasons why the Obama administration had to withdraw the request from the US Congress and the US Senate to give permission, because it had an effect in changing public opinion in America and in the American Congress. So that was the first piece of really good news. Second was that the United States and Russia are beginning to get together. At the beginning of this crisis, there was a complete split in the Security Council, and the Americans, particularly with Britain and France, were putting forward these provocative kind of resolutions which were trying to repeat the Libyan experience and get permission to attack Syria. The Russians kept having to veto that. But now the US and Russia are working together. Of course, that's not a sufficient change to bring about a solution in Syria, but it is a necessary change. Without that change, we couldn't move on, I think. And so that brings me to the third good thing, which is the Geneva II conference, which has now been designated to take place on January the 22nd next year. It's been much delayed, and of course we cannot be sure that it will achieve anything, but at least it is the first serious effort to bring Syrians together from the various sides and try and find, hopefully, a political compromise solution and a ceasefire. And the fourth thing is that I think more and more Syrians realize that outside intervention is not going to happen in the form of NATO coming in. They realize that is off the agenda, and they are also moving against the idea of military intervention by anybody, the armed groups and so on. And when I was in Syria last in September, 2 months ago, and talked to people who were displaced, living in rotten conditions, homeless, I was gratified to hear people saying, you know, we realize, you know, it was wrong to support military intervention. It's only when you lose what you've had, security, health, education for your kids, a home above your heads, that you realize just how much you've missed. And they were saying it's easy to start a war, but it's much harder to finish it, but we desperately want to find a political solution. And of course, there's always been this huge silent group of Syrians, whether they're majority or minority, it's hard to know, of course, who don't like either side. They don't like Assad, they don't want that regime to continue, they want a more liberal, democratic, pluralistic regime, but they also do not like the militarization of the opposition and of course of the jihadis and the foreigners coming in. And so that group of people, that segment of people, I think is growing, and of course that puts some pressure on the armed groups to come to a settlement. So I'll just end by saying I think that the priorities are really to support the Geneva II conference, to get our government here to really put pressure on their clients, the opposition, to take part seriously in Geneva and not use it as a propaganda platform. Obviously Russia has to put similar pressure on the Assad government to come to Geneva with serious compromise proposals and take the thing seriously. And in the meantime also to push for local ceasefires, hopefully leading to a national ceasefire, because that's the best way of bringing humanitarian aid to people, is to stop the killing, and then people wouldn't have to flee their homes. Thank you.